Hey everyone, today I'm creating some floating circle cards. I have no idea who did this first. If I did, I would credit them. But I've seen this all across Pinterest, I've seen other content creators do it, and I thought it is a wonderful way to use up my scraps. You can see from this photo here that because of the clear, it just looks like it's floating on top of the card base. My main supplies today are some white card bases, some foam tape, some scraps of cardstock, including specialty paper, and then I have these clear covers in 150 micron weight, and then I've created a template of lots of 2¼ inch circles, and I'm just going to use that as a reference point when I actually create the components that I'm then going to die cut the circle out of. I just printed these out on a standard, there's a lot that you can just download off the web, and I am loading up 5 of these ready to go, which means that I will have enough circles to create 60 cards. I like to do things bulk, so this works perfectly for me, loading these all up ready to go. In the end, I did actually decide to cut these down a little further because a full A4 sheet is a little bit unwieldy to deal with. But I got started here thinking that I would work my way up from the bottom circles all the way to the top. And what I worked out pretty quickly is that if I stick things on from each side, then all of a sudden with the small pieces, I'm not able to line up the next one because these are not perfect. In the end, I persisted with it and I got through part of this sheet, and then I decided to cut it down to a little bit smaller so that it was a little bit easier to handle. I also decided that liquid glue was not the best plan, so I did use it for the first bundle of cards, but in the end, the wiggle room and being able to line up a little bit more easily was not worth any glue that seeped out from the edge. I did try to be pretty careful with it, but the reality is with liquid glue, if you use even a touch too much, it's going to smidge out the edge, and even though it dries clear, these are floating cards, so the clear plastic that is holding up, or the clear transparency that is going to be sitting up off the card, is part of the feature of the card. And if that's messy, I just think that's going to interfere with the overall outcome. So here I am going through my stash. You'll notice that all of my little piles around the edge are pretty much in color families, other than the top right corner, which is all of my bits and pieces of shimmer paper or glitter or mirror cardstock. Anything that's specialty is actually up in that corner. So you'll see me reach for that quite regularly. I did try to make sure in every one of my circles that I had some specialty cardstock or some specialty glitter paper of some kind. It just makes the circle itself look a little bit more special. And given this is a very, very simple card layout, I felt like that would actually make a difference. The other thing that was really important is I had a 2mm gap between each of the pieces of cardstock, so I was pretty uniform with the gaps, but I deliberately made sure that the widths of all of the different colors was completely different, and I tried not to have too many of a similar size next to each other. So every now and then you'll see me do 2 sort of smaller ones next to each other, but in general, I shuffle the widths around a lot. And that's just to make sure that, again, when I do the circle die over the top, it's going to look a little bit more interesting. This was a really, really fun way to try out really weird and radical color combinations. So you could do some research in advance on Pinterest and pick out some color charts and use those as a bit of a reference point, or you can just wing it like I did. I will say I didn't take too many risks. I think the biggest thing with me was I picked a starting point, and you can see here with this one that I just decided, all right, I'm going to grab all of the pieces of cardstock that are long enough to go across all 3 of the circles. And then that way I know that if I'm leaving a gap, they're all going to be the same and it's going to work out absolutely perfectly. Here is where I discovered the beauty of double-sided tape, and this was because these thin strips here, which are about maybe 5mm wide, 4 or 5mm, they already had double-sided tape on the back. And so as soon as I did that, I thought, oh, maybe I need to rethink my approach. And you will notice a little later in the video that I stop using liquid glue and I start actually using double-sided tape on the back of everything. This was such a fun project. I could have sat there all day. And in fact, ever since I made these cards, I've been thinking about different ways that I could adjust the design and create some more cards. Now, you could use just a different shape, and you could use a love heart or a star die or something else that you have in your stash. But what I'm thinking I might try out is actually just to do rectangles. Because one of the things I didn't end up using in the layout was the glitter cardstock that has almost a plasticky backing. I don't know if you've noticed that with some of the glitter cardstocks, that it's not paper, it's kind of embedded glitter on plastic. And it was so tricky to die cut these as it was. And die cutting that glitter cardstock is, I'm going to say, almost impossible. And what I found when I made these is not all of them would come out nice and easily, so I had to coax them a little bit. And then I had to use my little Cutterbee scissors just around the edge to kind of just trim off a little bit where it didn't come out nice and clean. I figure if I do something like a rectangle or a square, I don't need to do the die cutting. And honestly, that did take a really long time. And there's a few tricks to it that I'll share later in the video. But with a square or a rectangle, I can just trim it up with my trimmer and I'm good to go. So I figure that will be a great way for me to actually introduce some of that glitter cardstock. All right, now that I've chopped it in half and I'm working through my next panel, I decided to turn it around and just do 2 at a time. This just seemed easier than finding things that were the width of a full A4. This way, I've just got to go across, the 2 1/4 inch circles with a bit of a gap. So it's probably anything that's, 4 3/4 to 5 inches long is going to work absolutely perfect this way. I was grabbing combinations. I did do lots of browns and greens and then lots of oranges and yellows and pinks. And again, I brought out my double-sided tape here. And as I picked the piece of paper I was going to use or the piece of cardstock, I added the double-sided tape and then added it to the project. I do think if I'm thinking about how I would do this mass production style a little differently, I would normally go through all the scraps that I knew I was going to use, put double-sided tape on the back of everything, and then all I needed to do was peel it off before I add it to the project. So that would have been a way to be a little bit more efficient with it, but it didn't matter too much because I was just sitting down and having a lot of fun with the different colors and trying to work out which ones I could use up. I hate having leftovers and I hate wasting things, so this is literally perfect. This is going through quite a few of my scraps. I will say not all of my scraps, and there's quite a few little ones on the right hand side. So you can see those orange pieces in particular are quite short and a little bit narrow. And so I do try and use up a few of those as I work through this, but it's not too bad. The other thing I'll say is the circle guide underneath really helps me just make sure I know where the circles are likely to start and end when I do the die cutting. But they do not have to be perfect, and I'm not lining it up here, with absolute precision. I'm making sure I go a bit further off the end so that when I line up the circles in my die machine, I've actually got a little bit of wiggle room as to where I put them, and I just make sure they line up and have paper all the way under. And some of those short pieces, I put the die in exactly the right spot to get the outcome that I'm after. The other thing I did as well is when I was putting on the final bits and pieces and wanting to put it through my die machine, when this was cut in half, it was the perfect width to put on my Sizzix Big Shot. And I just had to trim off any paper that was hanging across the edge so it didn't get caught up in the machine. But that was pretty easy to do. And the die cutting, as I said, it was really painful. I don't know if it's because the transparency sheets I was using, cover pages for when you do like printing and binding. And so they were a little bit soft. They didn't just crisply cut through like transparency, other brands of transparency might do. But I did work out in the end, after trying different shims and different things to increase the pressure, that the best way to do it was actually to put a thick piece of cardstock directly under the clear panel. And what that meant is the die kept trying to cut through the plastic and into the cardstock, and that just meant it cut through way better than if I put any kind of shim underneath my cutting plate. So it meant that I ended up chopping up a whole bunch of just plain white cheap cardstock because I had to replace it every now and then, but it did give me a much cleaner result, and it meant I could pop those circles out of those templates way more easily. Okay, so here I am actually doing another approach, which is to cut the circles in a long strip and then just use the smaller pieces to just really quickly do one line. Now, what I will say is this was really, really fast to make decisions because I'm using all of these short little pieces and I'm getting rid of a ton of scraps. It's probably not as efficient as if you've got the 3 or the 2, but honestly, I did not have scraps that were the ones I wanted to use that had the width of doing 3. Doing this with 1 was super fast, but I would almost say maybe the one that was 2 circles wide was my favorite. And I think that's because I just knew I could get 2 cards each time I got all the way through the circles. And for me, I like crossing things off lists. I like mass producing. So that is probably the way that I will do this moving forward. And I can absolutely guarantee you I will definitely end up doing this type of project again. Now that I've finished with all of my die cutting, I am putting foam tape on the back of the little circles. And I'm not actually using rolls of foam tape. I'm using, I guess, lots of little squares. So I'm breaking them into strips and I'm using loads of it. I'm being very, very generous because the intent is for this to really look like it's floating above the card. And if I don't put loads of foam tape on, I'm just a bit worried that it's going to look really wrinkled and it's going to dip. And if I was certainly sending one of these cards in the mail, then I would think it would end up squashed and not look as good as it could by the time it was received by the recipient. Ideally, I would be using thin foam tape strips, and they do sell those at scrapbook.com. I will link them below. In fact, I'll link below everything that I've used today as long as the things are still available. I would definitely recommend those, but I was just using some old foam squares that were in my stash. They were a little bit old, so when I was peeling off the backing paper, it was a bit of a pain, and I just think if you were using the strips, it'd be way better. For my sentiment today, I'm using one of the scripty sentiments from the scrapbook.com Happy Birthday stamp set. It has loads of happy birthdays in different shapes and sizes. And for this one, it just meant that I had the exact right size to have a big bold sentiment at the bottom of the card. And then by the time I add the circle on top, the front panel is going to be completed. Now, I do these again bulk style, and I'm using 2 different colors of ink. I'm using the Versafine Clear Nocturne ink, which is so dark it looks like black, but I guess it's got a little bit of a blue tint to it. And then I was also using just a standard dye ink in a really, really dark brown. Now, this cardstock is just cheap bulk cardstock, and it's the same as I use for my card bases. And what I've done is I've cut some panels that are 5 1/4 by 4 so that I can layer this up a little bit on the front of the card base just to add a little bit more interest, given this card is just a really clean and simple approach. When I load them into my MISTI, I actually put a bit of a pile of them in and then I just take the card out as I stamp. For some reason, I just find this easier rather than reloading it over and over and over again. And for this one here, I actually did have a bit of a blurry stamp on one side, so I just flipped it over because no one's ever going to see the back. I'm really curious, have you created a floating card design before using transparency? This is the first time I've ever tried it. I've done shaker cards and similar things, but not with this. So it was really, really fun. I know I keep saying that, but I absolutely loved it. I did hate this bit. Peeling off the little plastic off the back was an absolute nightmare, and I have ordered myself some strip foam tape so that I can create some more of these in the future, and I won't have to suffer the pain of peeling off the back of all of those little squares. If you are enjoying the video, please make sure you hit the like button. That is how YouTube knows that it is something you've enjoyed and they share it to more viewers. Okay, so because I wanted to have the panel sit up a little bit off the card, I grabbed a pile of these old Project Life cards. So I seem to have a bunch of these in my stash, and a lot of them are designs that I'm not going to use. So I taped 2 of them together and then I cut them down to be slightly smaller than the front panel. And it's just enough that when I add it to a card base, it adds a little bit of a shadow around the edge, and it just adds just a little bit more interest to a super clean and simple card. By the way, when I put the panel on, I always turn it upside down and do the side that's closest to the fold. That way, if I need to trim something down, I can do that from the bottom, which is going to be the end that's easier to trim if the sizing is not perfect. I made loads of different color combinations today, and if you had particular purposes, you wanted to do maybe school colors as thank you cards for teachers or favorite colors of the recipient, you can customize these as much as you like. I just decided to use up scraps. So for me, it was about making sure that each card itself looked really nice and that it would be something I'd be proud to give somebody. But I didn't spend too much time thinking it through, which is a little bit unusual for me because normally I do like to plan things out and get my color combinations, exactly perfect. But in this instance, I was a little bit radical with it. For example, I don't think I would normally do a yellow, a brown, a teal, and a pink. But for me, I actually like that look, and I think that card's worked out really nicely. And I think that sparkly gold on it helps it look even that little bit extra special. I have put another video here that I think you might enjoy. Have a great day.